HPPodcraft.com.
In the end, the three men from Arkham, old white-bearded Dr. Armitage, stocky iron-gray Professor Rice, and lean, youngish Dr. Morgan, ascended the mountain alone. After much patient instruction regarding its focusing and use, they left the telescope with the frightened group that remained in the road, and as they climbed, they were watched closely by those among whom the glass was passed around. It was hard going, and Armitage had to be helped more than once. High above the toiling group, the great swath trembled as its hellish maker repassed with snail-like deliberateness. Then it was obvious that the pursuers were gaining.
That is the first paragraph from Chapter 10 of the Dunwich Horror, story by H.P. Lovecraft that we were covering here on the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast.
At HPPodcraft.com, and I am co-host Chris Lackey. With me, as always,
Chad Fifer.
Whoa.
What happened?
Chad, we've been kind of neck deep in the Dunwich Horror for the last month here.
It's a good place to be. I
love it. I love the story so much.
Yeah.
And, I don't hate, but I try not to bring up the role-playing game too much.
Mm-hmm.
But this particular story, I really feel like is where that game came from.
Well, yeah, and also because this story is somewhat of an anomaly because it's the heroes win. I mean, it's these heroes get together, they band together, they figure out what's going on, they get their books and they do the research, and then they go out and they freaking solve the problem.
Yeah. Spoiler alert.
Yeah, but that's why I think S.T. Joshi had written that he's not as big a fan of this story.
Yeah. I think it's just not as pure kind of Lovecraft philosophy or worldview. The universe is an unforgiving place, and that you can't win at something. And I have to say though that there's the big speech about how Yog-Sothoth will eventually come, and it's going to happen. The old ones are going to come back at some point, and I still think that this really fits within the framework because it's just temporarily stopped.
Yeah, all they did was save this little backwater village. Ultimately, I'm sure Yog-Sothoth will find a way.
Yeah, I mean, Yog-Sothoth is beyond space and time. It's some people aren't going to be able to stop it ultimately, and I think that still seems pretty obvious in the story. Now, there is a kind of a happy ending to it, so to speak, because the heroes prevail. They don't go insane at the end of it. They save the town of Dunwich. So
happy ending for now.
For now
is basically what it is. But I don't care that it's. I've got room for all of it. There's plenty of despairing Lovecraft stories. I like to have one where the heroes
exactly. I'm with you too. It's good to. Yeah. I don't know. It just kind of gets you excited. Mm-hmm. We read a lot of Lovecraft, Chad.
That's true.
And it's nice to get a story that's a bit of a change up.
Yeah, exactly. Now, there's almost a joke. We ended in the last chapter, and at the end of our last show, it was these three heroes from Miskatonic about to confront the monster, and they had a whole gaggle of guys with them. There were a bunch of dudes from the countryside in Dunwich there who had gone and said, "What's the plan?" And they followed him out to the ruins of this house. And that's the end of Chapter 9 when Armitage is like, all right, let's go. And then when we get to Chapter 10, it's just those three guys going up the mountain, and all the dudes are standing there with the telescope. We see that everybody's ready to go. We cut to commercial, and then when we come back, it's just those three guys. It's so funny.
Armitage gives him the telescope and just says, you watch from here. We're going to go up and deal with this. Because I don't think there's much that those guys would be able to really do in this particular circumstance.
Well, it also provides a great Lovecraftian situation. I mean, he really crafted an interesting way to play out the climax of the story, which is guys who aren't actually up there. He doesn't have to tell you what they say, and he doesn't have to dramatize it so much, because it might end up being sort of cheesy if he did that. Instead, we're going to witness everything with the men of Dunwich who can only see it through a spyglass.
Right.
So it's an interesting way to frame the situation to avoid cheesiness.
Yeah, exactly. It kind of filters out, because if we focused with Armitage, then it would have to be Armitage says "Chugalaga Muga Laga Diga," and then he waves his hands around, and you know what I mean? Like that stuff can be really silly, but it becomes mysterious and strange. We're with the people of Dunwich trying to figure out what is it they're doing. It looks like he's waving his arms around. I don't know. We can only see silhouettes from where we are, and the sky's getting dark, and it's a really cool way to do it.
Yeah, and it starts with Curtis Whately, who's got the telescope and says, "Hey, they're flanking the thing. They can see the trees moving. That the thing is moving up Sentinel Hill towards the top, but that these guys have kind of broken out by a different route so they can get up ahead of it." Then another guy grabs a telescope from him and says, "Hey, Armitage, he's checking on that insect sprayer. I think they're gonna use that." And Curtis says, "What? Let me see it." And he grabs the telescope back and he looks as Rice takes that insect sprayer and just unleashes this sort of cloud of dust at the moving invisible thing. And whatever it is that he reveals when he does that, we don't get to know because Curtis drops the telescope and screams like a girl, right?
Right. Well, we do know, because after he screams like a girl, it's like, Curtis, what did you see? And then he explains what it was that he saw.
Bigger than a barn, all made of squirming ropes. Whole thing sort of shaped like a hen's egg, bigger than anything, with dozens of legs like hogsheads that half shut up when they step. Nothing solid about it, all like jelly and made of separate wriggling ropes pushed close together. Great bulging eyes all over it. 10 or 20 mouths or trunks sticking out all along the sides, big as stovepipes, and all a-tossing and opening and shutting, all grey with kind of blue or purple rings. God in heaven, that half face on top.
Whoa. So
boy.
we get, that's a description of the Dunwich Horror. That's it. It's this giant egg-shaped thing that's made up of like a bunch of ropes, and there's eyes all over it. It's just, oh my God.
And that half face on top, Robert Price, who was with us for the first couple shows, he had made reference to that earlier.
Yeah, later on in this chapter, they say that the half face looks like old Wizard Whately.
I mean, the thing is clearly related to that family. It's pretty horrible, but we don't know that yet. Now, Curtis collapses before he can say anything more to describe that half face on top. That's just the last thing he says that sort of knocks him out.
Right.
And the guys grab the telescope again, and they look up, and they can only see the three men. They're just like running up to the summit of the hill. Whippoorwills are starting up again everywhere. The men get to the summit. Earl Sawyer grabs the telescope, and he sees that one of the men is raising his hands in rhythmic intervals, and they think they can hear some faint chanting of some kind. And somebody even says, "I guess he's saying the spell."
Yeah.
Now they see that all of the men are raising their arms, and lightning is starting to form in the sky, and there's this rumbling sound brewing beneath the hills, and all the dogs are starting to go nuts and howl and bark from a nearby farmhouse. And then there are some deep, cracked, raucous vocal sounds that are as loud as the rumbling of the thunder, and they sound like no human voice, and yet they're definitely words of some kind.
Rang the hideous croaking out of space. The speaking impulse seemed to falter here, as if some frightful psychic struggle were going on. Henry Wheeler strained his eye at the telescope, but saw only the three grotesquely silhouetted human figures on the peak, all moving their arms furiously in strange gestures as their incantation drew near its culmination. From what black wells of acherontic fear or feeling, from what unplumbed gulfs of extra-cosmic consciousness or obscure, long-latent heredity were those half-articulate thunder-croakings drawn? Presently they began to gather renewed force and coherence as they grew in stark, utter, ultimate frenzy. Help! Help! Father! Father! Yog-Sothoth! But that was all. The pallid group in the road, still reeling at the indisputably English syllables that had poured thickly and thunderously down from the frantic vacancy beside that shocking altar stone, were never to hear such syllables again. Instead, they jumped violently at the terrific report which seemed to rend the hills, the deafening cataclysmic peal whose source, be it inner earth or sky, no hearer was ever able to place. A single lightning bolt shot from the purple zenith to the altar stone, and a great tidal wave of viewless force and indescribable stench swept down from the hill to all the countryside. Trees, grass, and underbrush were whipped into a fury, and the frightened crowd at the mountain's base, weakened by the lethal fetter that seemed about to asphyxiate them, were almost hurled off their feet. Dogs howled from the distance. Green grass and foliage wilted to a curious sickly yellow gray, and over field and forest were scattered the bodies of dead whippoorwills.
Wow.
That is some climax.
Climax with a cleansing bolt of lightning.
Always. Single lightning bolt comes down and cleans it all up, and suddenly it is all over.
Yeah, it's over. But I mean, all the whippoorwills are dead. Obviously, the horror is dead. It's destroyed. But it spoke as it died. It said, "Help, help, father, father, Yog Sothoth."
Yeah, it spoke in English. This thing,
which is strange. You talked a little earlier about how it sort of bided its time, even though it seemed mostly like it was just an animal. It had intelligence.
Yeah, in fact, there's something that Wilbur says earlier in the story that implies, as he studies, so is the creature. So is his the thing up in the attic is also reading and studying and learning. So they're on a parallel track, which lends itself to what Robert was talking about in an early episode, that these are really essentially the same character. One just picks up from the other one. So they have the same purpose and the same intelligence. Between this it resembled the father more, I think.
Both of them are necessary. They're two parts of the ritual that needs to bring Yog Sothoth into this world, which would destroy Earth, wipe it clean, is what Wilbur kept talking about. When you miss one part, the other part didn't know what to do. I think it lost its purpose. In a way, it's a little tragic, I think, that this thing is just kind of wandering around, not knowing what it's supposed to do, and it's just eating, and it goes up to Sentinel Hill because it knows it has some significance, but it's not able to complete the ritual that it needs to do.
Yeah.
So these guys kind of put it out of its misery in a way.
They come down the hill with the sun sort of beaming behind them. It's a heroic moment.
Yeah.
And everybody wants to know what's up, but Armitage just says, hey, the thing is gone forever, can't exist again. No. Most of it is returned in some way to its father in some realm outside of the material universe. But then Curtis starts freaking out again about this face that he saw. It says,
that face, with the red eyes and crinkly albino hair, and no chin like the Whateleys. It was a octopus, centipede, spider kind of thing, but there was a half-shaped man's face on top of it, and it looked like Wizard Whately's, only it was yards and yards across.
Oh man, that is crazy.
Yeah, I can't even picture what this thing looks like. It's so disturbing.
That's really more disturbing that I didn't put it together that Wizard Whatley might have actually impregnated his daughter.
Yeah, had been the vessel.
The vessel for Yog Sothoth to be able to, which it makes it extra creepy for, I don't know why that's any more creepy than her getting on with some big ropey tentacle monster.
Well, because presumably she's not related to the ropey tentacle.
Yeah, exactly.
So when you add you put the incest on top of it.
It just makes it nasty. Extra creepy, man.
Zebulon speaks up at this point and reminds everybody that 15 years ago, old Whatley had said that they'd hear a child of Lavinie's calling its father's name on the top of Sentinel Hill. I don't know if this is quite the way that he thought it was going to turn out, but that prophecy was certainly fulfilled.
That's true, yeah.
And the fact that there was that prophecy still lends a sort of biblical-ish, is that a word? But it's got that kind of mythological intonation to it.
Right, absolutely.
That everything came to the end that was prophecy, but it happened in a more tragic way than anybody could have expected.
Right.
And the men still want to know, what was this thing? And Armitage responds and gives this sort of 1950s B-movie,
it is a bit,
explanation here at the end. It says,
it was mostly a kind of force that doesn't belong in our part of space, a kind of force that acts and grows and shapes itself by other laws than those of our sort of nature. We have no business calling in such things from outside, and only very wicked people and very wicked cults ever try to. There was some of it in Wilbur Whately himself, enough to make a devil and a precocious monster of him, and to make his passing out a pretty terrible sight. I'm going to burn his accursed diary, and if you men are wise, you'll dynamite that altar stone up there and pull down all the rings of standing stones on the other hills. Things like that brought down the beings those Whateleys were so fond of, the beings they were going to let in tangibly to wipe out the human race and drag the earth off to some nameless place for some nameless purpose. But as to this thing we've just sent back, the Whateleys raised it for a terrible part in the doings that were to come. It grew fast and big from the same reason that Wilbur grew fast and big. But it beat him because it had a greater share of the outsideness in it. You needn't ask how Wilbur called it out of the air. He didn't call it out. It was his twin brother. But it looked more like the father than he did.
and that's the end.
Yeah, that's the end of the story.
Has that italicized ending. I mean, I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that it was a twin brother. Maybe it was the first time I read this. I can't remember.
Yeah, I think it was. I was surprised by it, I have to say. That the whole idea of the incest and all that was after the fact. When I just read it, I just thought it was a monster.
This was a great read. I mean, I was actually sad that I knew I was pretty familiar with the story from when I read it. I don't know, maybe when I was a teenager.
Oh, I've read it again recently. I read it maybe 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, well, I read it again, but I know I wish I could go through it the first time again, because some of these things were quite surprising to me. As I'd mentioned earlier, when Wilbur gets killed, that totally took me by surprise. I didn't expect that to happen. The plot in this, I think, is really good.
Oh, yeah.
People accuse Lovecraft of just having events happen, or he always focuses on it as just sort of one weird occurrence, and it's the weirdness of it that interests him. But here we have definite plot. Something terrible happens, and then we go, but wait a minute, we cut back to Miskatonic University, and we have some scenes there, and then we come back. It's got an almost sort of cinematic feel to it and a pacing, and I think it's outstanding. More so than almost any other story that he's written up to this point. It's got a real motivated plot. It's a page turner. I
think it's great, but it has been criticized as being sort of, we talked about this a little bit, but it's a good versus evil story, which really isn't Lovecraft's type of thing. Donald R. Burleson, he suggested that the tale be read like a satire of the typical good versus evil story. And the reason why he says that is because in the quote in the Necronomicon, it says, "Man rules now where they, the old ones, ruled once. They shall soon rule where man rules now." And that's saying that it is inevitable that they're going to come back. So this victory is really not that big of a victory in the grand scale of things. And in fact, It's kind of a joke. It's like, I'm the valiant man and we did this thing. It's like, well, not really. It's nothing compared to the gods. I think Lovecraft says, remember how I said that he was relating to Armitage, the character? I don't think he means this as a joke. I think Lovecraft really gets into the idea of good beating evil. And I'll read you this quote from Lovecraft. This is what he said. "I found myself psychologically identifying with one of the characters, an aged scholar who finally combats the menace towards the end." And he said that, and there was a letter to August Derleth, that he doesn't mean this as a parody. He just liked the character and he wanted him to win and have a victory. And even Lovecraft appreciates that type of thing.
I mean, I honestly don't think it's a parody of any kind. When Lovecraft does that, he writes something like Reanimator. It's pretty obvious to me. But it just seems to, this is a ripping yarn, it's just a good adventure story. And because it's heroic and it has a traditional good versus evil thing, I think that maybe the tendency is for us to say, well, Lovecraft would have been winking and nudging if he'd have written something like that. It's below him somehow.
Not at all.
The only thing about it that I think is maybe overboard is the excessive sort of explanation at the end.
Yeah, it does. It does have that kind of B-movie sort of feel to it, which is something that was in The Last Test. I had that kind of same feeling.
Yeah.
And those were both written closely to each other, so it might be just sort of what Lovecraft is particularly into at this point. And this is, another thing, I mentioned this earlier, that when Lovecraft went out to Wilbraham, Massachusetts, and that's sort of where he got the inspiration for Dunwich. His friend Edith Mittner, who he met through the amateur journalism movement, that Lovecraft kind of gets this reputation of being a hermit and not like going out, not having friends and not dealing with that, which is totally not the case. He traveled all over the United States and he made lots of friends through these and he would go visit them.
Yeah.
And in this particular story, when he went out to go visit her, and that's where he got all of his inspiration for his stories, he's a sociable guy. And you get it in his letters that he's not this weird, freaky kind of character. Like, he's really cordial, he's funny, and I could see why he would make all these friends and these people would be excited for him to come visit them.
Yeah, absolutely. The moodus noises, the rumbling that happened, that Wilbur was born 9 months after there was this sort of earthquake almost that happened in the Dunwich area, and that was somewhat based on a real phenomenon.
Yeah.
It is called the moodus noises, which is named for the town of Moodus, Connecticut.
Right. I do remember reading
Yeah,
this.
there were like subterranean rumblings and cracking noises and that type of thing that people couldn't figure out. That had been happening for a couple hundred years, way back when the town was first settled. And I think that they just suspect that it's some kind of plate shifting or something like that. But I don't even think it's still been figured out what that was.
No.
Or what it is, but I think that played somewhat into the story. He knew about this unusual tectonic activity, and so he kind of brought it in. And there's a lot of mention of pagan holidays in the story.
Yeah,
It's somewhat significant, right? There's a part where he says something about Candlemas, but they have a different name for it around there, which is it's one of the celebrations of the Witches' Sabbath. It's called Imbolic, the banishing of winter.
Well, a lot of that too is Celtic stuff.
Right.
I mean, Halloween is Celtic, and then May, which is on the other end of it. So they have the spring holiday and then the fall or the autumn, if you're in England.
Yeah,
like
well, Purgus Nacht.
Right, exactly. And it's just harking back to an older time. And, there was also there still is a lot of standing stones in New England, like these hills and things.
Mm-hmm.
Lovecraft talks about those quite a bit.
You mean this when he makes reference to like the stones on the top of these hills that might have been...
They could be found throughout New England. Specifically, there's an area called Dogtown between Gloucestershire and Rockport. And Lovecraft visited the region in 1927. He doesn't mention Dogtown specifically, but there are megaliths there. And there's also other areas. Mystery Hill in Salem, but that was actually a bogus megalith site.
Oh, really?
The 19th century farmer had built it up to kind of make it look like an old Indian site and get people interested. And actually, something like that happened here in England. There are in North Yorkshire, there is this area of standing stones, which looks a little like Stonehenge. But a rich guy that lived up there had it built in the late 1800s because he had all these workers that were out of work, and he goes, hey, let's make a tourist attraction. So he got all these guys to dig up all these stones, and they built one of those. So this happens actually, where people...
And they actually built it to the correct scale. It wasn't a tiny little Stonehenge.
Oh no, no, he didn't accidentally write out the inches mark and hand them the plans to it. Yeah,
in danger of being crushed by a dwarf.
That's happened in England, and that's happened in the States. But these things are common. I've never been around New England to be able to check this stuff out, but I believe they're still around.
I'm going to try that here in Santa Monica.
You're going to build some standing stones?
Yeah, I'm going to put like a monolith up on the roof of my apartment building. Like the Indians put this here.
I'm sure they'll believe it.
But Chad, the apartment was built in the 1950s. Shut up!
So about the whippoorwills, Lovecraft actually wrote a little essay called Mrs. Mittner Estimates and Recollections. And he wrote this in 1934, and he says, I saw the ruinous, deserted old Randolph Beebe house, where the whippoorwills cluster abnormally, and learned that these birds are feared by the rustics as evil psychopomps. It is whispered that they linger and flutter around houses where death is approaching, hoping to catch the soul of the departed as it leaves. If the soul eludes them, they disperse in quiet disappointment, but sometimes they set up a cuckold's clamor which makes the watchers turn pale and mutter, with the air of hushed, awestruck portentousness which only a backwards Yankee can assume. They got 'em.
It's really cool that they all die at the end of the whippoorwills falling out of the sky.
Well, yeah, kind of. It's full circle. Yeah, because they were definitely associated with Watleys. So when all of the Watleys were finally killed off, that the whippoorwills kind of went with them.
Great device.
I hate to let this go because I love the story so much, but we've kind of exhausted all there is to talk about it.
Hey, you know what we have next? The Electric Executioner. That's what we're doing next.
Really?
I have no idea anything about that story, but yeah, the Electric Executioner.
The Electric Executioner?
Which is a cool sounding title, be a good metal song or something, but I'm disappointed to see it's a revision done with Adolf de Castro, so there's a possibility that it's going to be...
We're doing another de Castro story, aren't we?
Yeah, but you know what? Maybe this time it'll be good. I don't know anything about it.
No, I've never read it either.
I doubt it'll be a Dunwich Horror, but maybe it'll be a little gem.
It might be a surprise. It might be for surprise. I was quite happy with Yig.
I was too. That was a good one. But that was Zelia Bishop. Now, after the Electric Executioner, we do have another couple collaborations he did with her, The Mound and Medusa's Coil. So those are coming up as well. And then after that, we're going to have The Whisper in Darkness and At the Mountains of Madness. So there's some serious stuff coming up. I've been reading the script of At the Mountains of Madness.
Oh, you have? You've got a hold of it?
Yeah, the Del Toro script. I mean, I don't know if it's been changed. I assume it has been since then, but a listener sent it to me, and I've been looking through it. It's really cool, man. It's
Oh,
good.
yeah.
I hope that movie is actually getting made. It's neat.
Oh, wow. There's a rumor going around that actually Joshi is an advisor on.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, I hope that's all true. The last I heard, though, the studio hadn't written the check yet.
Oh, really?
So Del Toro's saying, "Hey, I think it's going to happen, but until we're in production,
Until money starts getting put in our coffers, we're not.
Well, it's a lot to ask to fund a horror movie at that level. It just doesn't happen very often.
No.
Most horror movies are made for very little money, and to make a gigantic spectacle, it's a horror story. I mean, there's
Yeah.
no getting around that.
No.
So it's this is an Avatar. This is
No.
people flipping out and going crazy and learning the history of the world and everything. So
Yeah.
I'll be surprised if it happens.
It could be. It could be a huge bomb. It might be a really cool movie,
yeah.
but it might just be not what general audiences are looking for.
Yeah.
And you got to kind of be realistic about that, because most people don't like horror films. It won't have that universal feel or appeal that like Avatar had. It's a very simple story, and it's very fantastic, and it's got great visuals,
Right.
and it's kind of, the good guys win and everybody thing is done and the bad guys get punished, but not in Mountains of Madness.
I'm surprised all the time. I'll say, "Hey, I'm going to see, whatever the horror movie is that's out at the time," and people will look, "Oh, I don't see those movies."
Yeah, I don't go to horror films. Yeah.
Just blanket, I don't do it. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it always is a surprise. Really? Why? To me, they're like comedies in the same way. It's just an enjoyable thing. You get set up, and then there's the scare, and then you move on, and that, it's great stuff. But a lot of people, they don't dig on it.
Well, with that, I want to say thank you to Andrew Lehman, who always does a wonderful job. And everybody go to the HP Lovecraft Historical Society's website, cthulhulives.org, and get the Dunwich Horror radio play, because it's great. It is really, really good.
Thanks again, Robert M. Price, for coming on the show and helping us through a bit of this story. That guy's awesome.
He's great. And
You should listen to his, he's got a couple of his own shows, Point of Inquiry,
Yep.
obviously, that he does. But there's also The Bible Geek. Have questions about the Bible or want to hear somebody who's an excellent expert at that kind of thing. He's got such an interesting point of view because he's steeped in this Christian theology, but he's an atheist.
yeah.
So it's interesting. He knows all about the historicity of Jesus Christ. I wrote a joke when Wilbur Whatley was born. I was going to say, "Robert, I don't think that he ever existed, and I want you to disprove that." I didn't get to work it in there. He's a good guy. So, okay, that's all we got, and we're going to be on the Electric Executioner next week. I'm Chad Fifer.
And I'm Chris Lackey.
And this has been the HP Lovecraft Literary Podcast.
At HPPodcraft.com.
HPPodcraft.com